Three police officers step into a quiet diner on a chilly November evening. Laughter fills the air as they settle in, until they spot a lone figure at the corner table. At first, he looks like any other diner patron, but something about him feels familiar. When they approach, they don't realize who he is. A few teasing remarks later, their laughter fades as they catch sight of a worn piece of paper on his table. What they see changes everything. Who is this man, and what secret is he carrying? It was a cold November evening in Los Angeles when three off-duty police officers stepped into a quiet diner near Silver Lake. The warm glow of the neon signs flickered against the glass windows, casting a soft light over the mostly empty booths. Outside, the city pulsed with life, but inside, the world seemed to slow down, a haven for late-night loners and weary travelers. The officers, Sergeant Mark Reynolds, Officer Scott Mason, and Officer Dave Holloway, laughed amongst themselves as they entered, shaking off the chill from the brisk evening air. They had just wrapped up a long day, one filled with paperwork, endless radio calls, and the kind of bureaucratic nonsense that drained the spirit out of law enforcement. A good meal and a few light-hearted jokes were just what they needed. "Man, I could eat a horse," Scott muttered as he glanced around the diner, looking for an open table. "Or at least a triple bacon cheeseburger." "More like a triple heart attack," Dave shot back, smirking. "You keep eating like that, you'll be the first guy I arrest for criminal cholesterol levels." They all chuckled as they found an empty booth near the counter. But before they sat down, Mark nudged Scott, nodding towards the farthest corner of the diner. "Hey, check it out," he said in a low voice. At a booth by the window, a man sat alone, sipping a cup of coffee. He wore a simple denim shirt and a pair of well-worn jeans. His beard was neatly trimmed, his expression calm but unreadable. Something about him seemed oddly familiar, but none of them could quite place why. Scott squinted. "Wait a second, isn't that Chuck Norris?" Dave finished, his voice barely above a whisper. They exchanged glances, trying to suppress their grins. "Isn't this guy supposed to be living in a mansion somewhere, roundhouse, kicking criminals in his sleep?" Scott whispered, smirking. "What's he doing here in a hole-in-the-wall diner?" "Maybe he's training for his next role, Lone Diner Avenger," Dave quipped. The three men chuckled, their voices carrying just enough to be heard. Chuck, who had been calmly flipping through the pages of an old leather-bound journal, glanced up briefly, acknowledging them with a polite nod before returning to his reading. Mark, emboldened by the relaxed atmosphere, motioned to the others. "Come on, let's say hi." They approached the booth, their badges glinting under the diner's soft lighting. Well, Scott said as they stopped at Chuck's table. "Didn't expect to see the legend himself grabbing a cup of joe at a place like this." Chuck looked up, his blue eyes calm but observant. "Just enjoying a quiet evening," he said in a low, steady voice. Dave, always the jokester, leaned against the table. "You planning to roundhouse kick the special tonight?" he teased. Scott snickered. "Or maybe just staring down crime until it turns itself in?" Chuck merely smiled, unfazed by their teasing. He didn't respond, instead flipping to the next page of his journal, his fingers tracing the edge of a small, folded piece of paper tucked inside. Mark, glancing at the worn paper, frowned. Curiosity got the better of him. "Hey, what's that?" he asked, nodding toward it. Chuck hesitated for a moment before gently unfolding it. The officers leaned in slightly, expecting to see something related to his legendary martial arts career, perhaps an old script, or maybe even some training notes. Instead, they were met with something entirely different. The paper contained simple, childlike drawings, crude sketches of a man holding hands with a young girl, both of them smiling. Stick figures, nothing more. But beneath them, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for being my hero, Uncle Chuck. Love, Emma." The mood at the table shifted instantly. Scott's grin faded. Dave's arms, once crossed casually, lowered to his sides. Mark felt a strange knot form in his stomach. The paper was well worn, its edges softened and torn from being folded and unfolded countless times. The ink had faded in some spots, as if fingers had run over the words many times before. It was clear this piece of paper had been cherished. Mark glanced at Chuck, who was now silent, staring at the paper with an expression none of them could read. There was something in his gaze, something deeper than nostalgia. It was grief. It was love. It was something the officers didn't fully understand, but they knew, in that moment, that they had misjudged the man in front of them. The diner, once filled with light banter, now felt unbearably quiet. Scott cleared his throat. That's a nice drawing. Chuck finally looked up, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. It is. Mark hesitated. Who's Emma? For the first time that evening, Chuck closed his journal and leaned back against the booth, his fingers still resting lightly on the paper. He seemed to weigh his words carefully before speaking. Emma was someone very special, he said simply. The officers exchanged glances, unsure whether to press for more. But before they could decide, Chuck gently folded the paper back up and tucked it into his journal, as if sealing away a memory too personal to share just yet. Dave exhaled slowly. We didn't mean to intrude. Chuck shook his head, the warmth returning to his expression. It's okay, he said. Most people only see what's on the screen. They don't see the things that matter off camera. The officers nodded, understanding now that there was more to Chuck Norris than the action hero they had grown up watching. He wasn't just a legend in film. He was something more, something real. Enjoy your evening, Mr. Norris, Mark said as they turned to leave, their moods noticeably more subdued than when they first entered the diner. Chuck nodded in response, lifting his coffee cup slightly in farewell. As they walked away, Scott glanced back one last time and saw Chuck staring at the folded paper again, his thumb brushing gently over the words. The three officers took their seats in their booth, but the energy was different now. The laughter from earlier had quieted. Each of them, in their own way, was still thinking about what they had seen, about the name Emma, about the quiet sorrow in Chuck's eyes. Scott leaned back against the booth, exhaling. Guess we all got Chuck Norris wrong. Mark nodded. Yeah, he's not just some action star. He's something else. Dave drummed his fingers on the table, lost in thought. I wonder what her story was. None of them knew that the answer to that question would stay with them long after they left that diner. And for Chuck Norris, that folded piece of paper would remain a silent reminder of a promise made, and a love that never faded. Outside, the city moved on, but inside that small, dimly lit diner, three officers had just glimpsed a side of Chuck Norris that few had ever seen, and they would never forget it. The night air outside the diner was crisp, and Chuck Norris sat for a long time staring at the folded paper in his hands. His fingers traced the edges, feeling the worn creases that had formed over years of careful handling. The officers had seen it, but they had no idea what it really meant. Few people did. It was more than just a drawing. It was a piece of his heart, a reminder of a promise he had made long ago. The first time he met Emma, she had been a shy 6-year-old with a mop of dark curls and the widest brown eyes he had ever seen. She clung to the leg of her father, Tom, who had once been one of Chuck's closest childhood friends. Life had taken them in different directions, but when Tom called him after years of silence, there was something in his voice that made Chuck drop everything to meet him. They met at a small park, the kind with rusted swings and a half-broken slide. Emma had hidden behind her father's leg, peeking out at Chuck with cautious curiosity. Tom looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper than Chuck remembered. He was thin, too thin, and when Chuck reached out to shake his hand, Tom's grip was weak. Thanks for coming, Tom said. His voice was rough, and he cleared his throat as if trying to steady himself. I wasn't sure if you'd. Of course I came, Chuck interrupted. What's going on, Tom? Tom exhaled, glancing down at Emma before meeting Chuck's gaze. I need a favor. A big one. Chuck had been expecting something serious, but he wasn't prepared for what came next. Tom had been diagnosed with a rare illness, and the prognosis wasn't good. The doctors had given him months, maybe a year if he was lucky. And Emma, she had no one else. I don't have family, Tom admitted, and I can't let her end up in foster care. She needs someone who will love her, someone who will protect her. Chuck had spent his life facing impossible challenges, but nothing had ever felt as overwhelming as the weight of those words. He looked at Emma, who was now playing with the edge of her father's sleeve, still too young to understand the depth of what was happening. Tom, Chuck's voice faltered, but he quickly steadied himself. "You're asking me to." "I know it's a lot," Tom said quickly. "And I wouldn't ask if I had another option. But I need to know she's going to be okay." Chuck looked down at Emma again, this time meeting her eyes fully. They were filled with quiet curiosity, a depth of innocence that hadn't yet been touched by the pain of what was coming. She didn't know yet. Tom hadn't told her. "Does she know?" Chuck asked softly. Tom shook his head. "Not yet. I don't know how." Chuck had faced opponents in the ring, enemies on the screen, and challenges in real life that tested every ounce of his strength. But looking at Emma, knowing what she was about to go through, made him feel helpless. He wasn't a father. He had no idea how to raise a child. But he had made a career out of standing up for those who couldn't protect themselves. And he wasn't about to stop now. "I'll do it," he said finally. Tom exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging as if a great weight had been lifted. "Thank you," he whispered. "You don't know what this means to me." Chuck only nodded, still staring at Emma. She had no idea how much her life was about to change. Neither did he. The months that followed were some of the hardest Chuck had ever experienced. He spent as much time with Tom and Emma as possible, knowing that time was running out. He watched Tom grow weaker, saw the way he struggled to hide his pain from his daughter. And when the time came to tell her the truth, Chuck was there, holding her small hand as she sobbed into her father's chest. It wasn't fair. No child should have to lose a parent. But life wasn't fair, and Chuck had learned long ago that the only thing that mattered was how you faced it. Tom passed away on a quiet morning in November. Emma didn't cry at first. She sat in the corner of the hospital room, clutching the small stuffed bear her father had given her. Chuck knelt beside her, unsure of what to say, knowing that no words could take away the pain. Eventually, she looked up at him, her brown eyes shining with unshed tears. "Where is he now?" she asked, her voice small and fragile. Chuck swallowed the lump in his throat. "He's still here," he said, pressing a hand over her heart. "In here. Always." The first few weeks after the funeral were the hardest. Emma barely spoke. She moved through the days like a shadow, lost in grief. Chuck did his best to keep things normal, to cook her favorite meals, to sit with her when she didn't want to be alone, to tell her stories when she couldn't sleep. It was a slow process, but little by little, she started to open up. One evening, she sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper and a handful of colored pencils. Chuck watched as she started to draw, her small hands moving carefully across the page. When she was finished, she slid it across the table to him. It was a picture of the two of them. A simple drawing, stick figures holding hands, but there was something about it that made Chuck's chest tighten. Beneath it, she had written, "Thank you for being my hero, Uncle Chuck." Chuck had never considered himself a hero. He had played heroes on screen, but that wasn't real. This was real. And for the first time in his life, he realized that being strong wasn't about how hard you could hit. It was about how much you could hold on when everything felt like it was slipping away. As he sat in the diner, staring at that same drawing, he felt the familiar ache settle in his chest. The officers had seen it, but they hadn't understood. How could they? It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a reminder of everything he had fought for, everything he had lost, and everything he had gained. He folded it carefully, slipping it back into his journal. Some memories were too precious to share. But as he finished his coffee and left the diner, he carried it with him. Not just the paper, but the promise he had made all those years ago. A promise he would keep for the rest of his life. Chuck stood outside the diner, the cool night air wrapping around him as he exhaled a deep breath. The memories from all those years ago weighed on him, but they also kept him grounded. He pulled his coat tighter around himself and walked toward his truck, parked just a few steps away. As he climbed in, he placed the journal on the passenger seat beside him, letting his fingers run over the worn leather cover before starting the engine. Driving through the quiet streets of Los Angeles, his mind drifted back to the early days with Emma. Those first few months had been a delicate balance of patience and understanding. She was grieving, lost in a world where everything she had known had been taken away in the blink of an eye. Chuck had done his best to give her stability, but it was clear she was still unsure of her place in this new life. There were moments of silence, Days where she would sit by the window and stare outside without saying a word. He never pressured her to talk, but he made sure she knew he was always there. Slowly, she started coming out of her shell. It started with small things, a nod instead of a shrug, a quiet thank you at dinner, a hesitant laugh at one of his bad jokes. And then, one evening, she finally opened up. They were sitting on the couch, a movie playing in the background, though neither of them was really watching it. Chuck had been flipping through an old book when Emma spoke. "Uncle Chuck," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did my dad ever talk about me? When you were kids?" Chuck set the book down and turned to her, surprised by the question. "All the time," he admitted with a small smile. "Tom was so proud of you. He'd always say you were the best thing that ever happened to him." Emma hesitated, fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. "I miss him." "I know, kiddo," Chuck said gently. "And that's okay. You don't have to stop missing him. But you're not alone. I'm here." She nodded, and for the first time, she leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. It was the beginning of something new, a step toward healing. Chuck knew it would take time, but at least now, they were moving forward together. Over the years, their bond only grew stronger. Chuck was there for every school project, every soccer game, every scraped knee. He taught her how to ride a bike, how to throw a punch, because, as he'd put it, every girl should know how to defend herself. She had an artist's soul, always sketching, always dreaming. She filled their home with drawings, each one a reflection of her emotions. And through it all, Chuck made sure she never felt alone. But life, as it often did, had its own plans. When Emma turned 16, she started feeling unusually tired. At first, they thought it was just the stress of school, but then came the frequent headaches, the dizziness, the unexplained bruises. Chuck knew something was wrong. He took her to the doctor, hoping it was nothing serious, but deep down, a fear was growing inside him. The diagnosis came like a punch to the gut. Leukemia, a word Chuck never wanted to hear, a battle he wasn't sure how to fight. He sat with Emma in the doctor's office as the reality of it settled in. She was strong, stronger than he ever could have imagined. She didn't cry, didn't panic. Instead, she looked up at him and said, "We'll get through this, right?" Chuck swallowed past a lump in his throat and nodded. "Yeah, kid, we will." The next few months were a blur of hospital visits, treatments, and long nights filled with quiet conversations. Chuck never left her side. He stayed with her through every round of chemotherapy, holding her hand when the pain became too much, distracting her with stories when she felt scared. He refused to let her see his own fear, but at night, when she was asleep, he would sit by her bedside, his head in his hands, silently praying for a miracle. Emma, despite everything, remained the light in his life. She still smiled, still cracked jokes, still found ways to make the nurses laugh. One day, she handed him a new drawing, a picture of the two of them standing under a bright sun, her hand in his. Beneath it, she had written, "No matter what, you're my hero." Chuck kept that drawing close, just like the first one she had ever given him. It was a reminder of the strength she carried, of the bond they had built over the years. She was his family, and he would fight for her with everything he had. But some battles weren't meant to be won. The doctors told him the treatments weren't working as they had hoped. The leukemia was aggressive, spreading faster than they could control. Chuck listened to their words, but none of it felt real. How could he lose her? How could he say goodbye to the girl who had become his whole world? Emma, however, seemed to understand before he did. One night, as they sat in her hospital room, she reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. "Uncle Chuck," she said softly, "you don't have to be strong all the time." Chuck looked at her, trying to hold back the tears threatening to spill over. I don't want to lose you." She gave him a sad but knowing smile. "You won't. I'll always be with you." He wanted to argue, to tell her that she had to keep fighting, but deep down, he knew she was right. She had always been wise beyond her years. She wasn't scared anymore. She had accepted what he couldn't. A few days later, Emma passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the people who loved her most. Chuck held her hand until the very end, his heart breaking in a way he had never experienced before. She was gone, but her spirit, her love, her laughter, it all remained. After the funeral, Chuck went home to the quiet house that once echoed with her presence. He sat in his study, the walls lined with her drawings, her sketches of their adventures together. He opened his journal, flipping to the pages where he had kept her notes, her doodles, the memories they had shared. His fingers brushed over the words she had written. "No matter what, you're my hero." Tears fell freely as he realized that, in the end, it wasn't him who had been the hero. It had been her all along. Chuck sat in the dim glow of his study, surrounded by the echoes of a life he had shared with Emma. Her drawings lined the walls, each one a frozen moment of joy, resilience, and a quiet strength that had defined her. The journal lay open before him, its pages filled with memories, each word a tether to a time that had slipped away too soon. He traced the words she had written with his fingertips, her handwriting small and delicate, yet brimming with warmth. The days after Emma's passing felt unreal. The world outside continued to move, indifferent to the loss that had shattered him. He went through the motions, thanking those who had come to the funeral, accepting their condolences, nodding at their well-intended reassurances that time would heal. But he knew the truth. Time wouldn't heal. It would only dull the edges, turning sharp pain into a lingering ache. He found solace in the little things. A coffee mug she had painted for him years ago, the edges chipped, but the words still clear. Best uncle ever. The stack of books they had read together, their pages marked with her tiny notes and doodles. The old pair of sneakers she had outgrown but refused to throw away because, as she had put it, they have too many adventures left in them. One evening, as he sat in the quiet, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Hesitating, he opened it. "Chuck, it's Dr. Myers. Emma wanted me to give you this when the time was right." Attached was a short audio file. His hands trembled as he pressed play. Her voice, soft but full of life, filled the room. "Hey, Uncle Chuck, if you're listening to this, it means I'm not around anymore, and that sucks. But don't be sad, okay? I mean, you can be sad for a little while, but not forever. You always told me that life was about moving forward, about finding light even in the darkest places. So promise me you'll do that." He let out a shaky breath, gripping the edge of the desk. "I left you something," she continued. "Check under the floorboard in my room. And don't make that face. You know exactly which one I mean. Love you, Uncle Chuck. Always." The message ended, leaving only silence behind. Chuck sat there for a long time before he finally stood and made his way to Emma's room. It had remained untouched, as if waiting for her to return. He kneeled beside her bed, ran his fingers over the floorboard she had always insisted was loose, and pried it open. Inside was a small wooden box, worn but sturdy. He lifted the lid to find a collection of things. More drawings, a Polaroid of the two of them at her last birthday, a letter in an envelope with his name scrawled across it. With trembling fingers, he unfolded the letter. "Uncle Chuck, if you're reading this, then I guess I'm gone. But I need you to know that I had the best life because of you. You made me laugh when I want to cry. You never let me feel alone. You made me feel loved. And that's more than a lot of people ever get, so thank you. I don't want you to be sad forever. You always told me that love never really goes away, that it just finds new ways to stay with us. So keep me with you, okay? Keep smiling, keep fighting, and keep being the best uncle in the world. Love, Emma." Tears blurred his vision, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to weep freely. He clutched the letter to his chest, feeling the weight of her words settle deep within him. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Chuck began to emerge from the shadow of his grief. He honored Emma in the way she had asked, not by mourning endlessly, but by living. He threw himself into charity work, helping kids who had faced similar struggles. He supported families who had lost loved ones. He shared Emma's story, not as a tale of loss, but as one of love and resilience. One evening, as he walked through a park, he spotted a little girl sitting on a bench, clutching a sketchbook. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with the same curiosity Emma had once had. Chuck smiled, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a blank notebook. He handed it to her. "You know," he said gently, "stories are the best way to keep someone's memory alive." As the girl took the notebook with a small smile, he felt something shift within him. Emma was still with him, not in a way that he could touch or see, but in every act of kindness, every laugh, every moment of love he chose to share. And that, he realized, was how she would live on forever.